This is part 2 of the build slash overview series for the Kyosho Lazer ZX5 FS2 SP. It's a pretty long name for a chassis. As you can see, the main part of the chassis is done. All that's left is to mount the servo and the motor, all the electronics, wheels and tires, paint the body, the wing, all the accessory stuff. But the main chassis is complete now. The rest of the build from the last video went fairly smoothly. The instructions did get better throughout the rest of the build, although I do have to criticize the instructions for the shocks. The shocks themselves are really nice. I really like these shocks. They're super smooth. There's no air bubbles. It's very nice. Although I will say that when you're building the shocks, very much like the old Schumacher Cat 2000 shocks, you don't fill the oil in from the top, you fill it in from the bottom and you bleed them through the bottom. If you put too much oil in the shock body, that bleeding process becomes extremely messy. So you need multiple paper towels to bleed them and clean the shock bodies off. With the associated shocks or any shock that has a bleeder hole at the top, you don't have that problem. But the problem with the bleeder hole at the top is that if you don't do it right, you will end up with air bubbles in the shocks. Here you don't have that problem at all. It's actually very nice. Now getting to the instructions for the shocks, the problem that I had here was actually with the shock cap. So the shock cap is actually a two-piece unit. There's this alloy unit that screws over the top, and then there's this plastic unit here that attaches to the shock tower. Now this plastic unit is attached to a parts tree. Let's see if I can find one of the spare ones here. This right here. So there's two pieces on this side and two on this side, and it turns out that they are slightly different sizes. Okay. Now if you'll remember from the first video, any parts tree that's not part of the parts bag number 1, the layout and map is not covered in the beginning of the manual. So over here, it says, okay, you need part number 378 for that shock cap. But the part is not labeled on the parts tree, and it's not labeled earlier on in the manual. So how am I to know which part is 378? It's not until later on when you actually look very closely at the instructions, you see, okay, for the rear shocks, it looks like the shock cap is a little smaller than in the front shocks. So only then do you realize which part you actually need to use for the front shocks and the rear shocks. I realized this only after building all of the shocks, and I noticed that the shock caps on one of the fronts was small and the other one was large. I just made the mistake of assuming these are all the same size, which they're not. So I had to take one of the shocks apart, dump all the oil out, swap the shock cap with one of the ones in the rear, and redo the oil, and that was very messy and time-consuming. So that's a problem. It also says here that you only need to build 2 shocks, and it does not tell you whether these 2 shocks are the front or rear shocks. I would assume that they are the front shocks because next you mount shocks to the front shock tower. But if you look closely at this shock cap, it looks like the smaller shock cap, which goes to the rear shocks, not the front shocks. So they kind of screwed up there as far as, giving you some clear instructions on what to put in the front and rear shocks and how many of them to do and the ordering and all that. So that was a little messy. But otherwise, the rest of the build did go reasonably well. It wasn't too bad. But the biggest problem I have with this manual is that there are more parts trees than what you have in parts bag number 1 alone. There are several parts trees. And the only parts that are mapped out are the ones in parts bag number 1. So that makes it very hard from time to time to figure out exactly which part you need to use from the parts trees. Another issue I have with the manual is that there is no factory setup. So you get a setup sheet, but it's completely blank. When you put the preload spacers on and you screw them on. It doesn't give you any instructions as to what should be the baseline spacing here between the preload spacer and the top of the shock cap. They basically leave it entirely up to you to figure out what setup you should use, which kind of sucks, because at least for the Associated manual you get some kind of factory setup that's been tested and it works pretty well over most conditions. You don't get that here. So I had to take a guess as to what shock oil to use front and rear, and I'll have to take a guess as to what ride height to use and everything else. So I'll try to replicate my B44 setup in terms of geometry and suspension setup and see how that goes. Presently I am using Losi 35 weight front and 30 weight rear oil in here. The shock pistons, you only get one type of shock piston. It's the same piston for the front and the rear. It has 4 or 5 holes. Let me check that. Yeah, it's a 5-hole piston. Same exact piston front and rear. There are no tuning options for that, at least for the parts that they give you in the kit. So I can only assume that what I have will work well enough. We will see in time. But this is it for now. I guess there's no need to make another video after all the electronics are installed, because that's fairly straightforward. Although I will say that the motor mount here is more difficult to use than on the B44. Well, the 44.0, the motor mount that came with that is like this one, where it's actually pretty hard to access the motor screws and check your gear mesh. But on the 44.1 and the .2, it came with a cam type motor mount, which you could purchase and install on the 44.0, which made it a lot easier to adjust your gear mesh. But on here, there's no cam type mount. You just have these slotted openings that you screw the motor mount screws into, and you need a long hex driver to screw through this opening into the bottom screw, and then you screw into the top one over this lip here, and you tighten everything down after you check your mesh. But since this little piece here, which is supposed to mask the spur gear from dirt, it also blocks your visibility as far as figuring out exactly what is the best mesh to have before tightening the motor screws down. It is probably going to be a little difficult to get perfect gear mesh, but I will deal with that in time. So I guess that's it for the build. Overall, I do like how the buggy looks in the end. I think it's very nice. The drivetrain is very smooth. The suspension is very, very smooth. It's really, really nice. I just wish that the instructions were better. This is a $500 chassis that you're buying, and you're paying only for the end product here. The build process kind of sucks. Hopefully it's worth it in the end. Hopefully it drives better than it builds, but we will see in time. So thanks for watching.